Well, thanks for making some time to talk to me, Lloyd. Now, obviously, you've had widely publicised health issues in recent times, but been back at work for some time now. What's your sort of weekly routine now that Marco is here at Infratil as the CEO? What's your role?
Well, the important thing about Marco's role is that I appointed him at least a year, maybe 18 months before I knew that I was ill. So it was fortuitous to the extent that when I became ill, there was somebody ready to take over. But I appointed him because the scale of Infratil and Morrison and Co was getting to a level that it needed it needed a better manager than me. And I think if I look back, as one tends to do when one's sick, on what you've done right and what you haven't done, I've always been very good at employing people. I've never had a fear of employing people who are smarter or better than me, and Marco's certainly a very good example of that. So Marco was employed as COO to become CEO before I became ill. So he literally took over that role as soon as my prognosis came through. Coming back, I hadn't wanted to retire when I made that original appointment. I'd wanted to compliment Marco, but coming back, I haven't really had the energy or health to consider a really significant role back in Morrison and Co and Infratil. So I've also been careful to not undermine his leadership in any way, because I have no interest in doing that. But it's something that people who run organisations do inadvertently, and for somebody with my personality, which is pretty hyper, that's always a risk. So I guess the things that Marco's running the ship, everybody's reporting to Marco, and that's how it should be. I guess I see myself perhaps as a keeper of the culture. I'm very interested in people's attitude to work, and the long-term focus, in the interests of shareholders in the longer term, and that's something I get pretty excited about. I'm also interested in giving back. I think that good organisations form a real part of the communities they operate in, and that's always been the case with Infratil and Morrison and Co, and I wouldn't want that to change. So I tend to get involved at that sort of level.
Okay, and you're still undergoing treatment, you're still having chemotherapy as well?
Yeah, the good news is that I'm stable. The bad news is that I still get quite a lot of treatment. So I get chemotherapy on a 6-week cycle at the moment, a week's worth of chemo and then 6 weeks off. But that's recently been moved from a 4-week cycle to a 6-week cycle, so that's an improvement.
Okay, and look, in terms of broader issues, obviously we've just had this terrible earthquake in Christchurch. We're still really learning what the full ramifications are. I mean, we know they're enormous. We know that a lot of people are dead, and it's a huge tragedy for New Zealand. How big of an impact do you think this is going to have on the entire country, and what do you think how can we best, I guess, respond and recover from it? And I mean, are you impressed with the way our politicians are doing that so far?
I'm deeply impressed with John Key. I think he's been incredibly genuine. He's been a real leader. So he's not only been there in amongst it, he's shown genuine compassion, and he's been very careful about not progressing and moving on to issues before it's the right time to do so. And I think that is one of the big challenges that we've got. There's certainly a deep acknowledgement throughout New Zealand and concern for the people of Christchurch. But we all know that these things are hard to sustain, despite the fact they're going to need sustaining, because it's quite clear to everybody that Christchurch is got some deeply personal issues that will go on for quite a while. So talk about rebuilding has to be done carefully. I have some cultural issues with New Zealand as a country, though. I think that we're very lucky because we're egalitarian, so we believe that real wealth is when everybody's better off, and that comes from the development of a culture when we were able to make sure that was the case. But in recent times we've slipped away from that position, but there's still a sort of naive comfort factor that you get in New Zealanders, that we don't need to change, that it's it's God's own country, and that's fair enough for a few people, but for many people there's increasing dislocation, and the underperformance of New Zealand actually hits the road for some people in areas of education or crime or health, which is something I'm very aware of now. So perhaps the silver lining that comes out of the Christchurch tragedy is a bit of a wake-up call for New Zealand about earning our way, because to put Christchurch back on its feet is going to empty the cupboards. So the government, quite rightly, has said that that's an absolute priority for the country, and nobody would question that. The result will be cutbacks in other parts of the country that perhaps we wouldn't have previously considered, and I think that it's possible that some of those cutbacks will actually be good for us in the longer term. But I think there is an urgency that is not highlighted at the moment, nor does it need to be, but we also need to think that just because the earthquake has happened doesn't mean to say that there's not another natural disaster that could befall New Zealand in the near term, and frankly I'm not sure that we could sustain it, given that going into this position we were already pretty much an underperforming economy. If you layer on top of that that world financial markets have not properly recovered, I think they're recovering, but systemically they're still highly risky in my view. The underlying problems of financial markets have not been addressed, and it doesn't look as though they're going to be, which is essentially the international banking system, which we rely on, is not respected in terms of regulation internationally in the way that it was previously. The Glass-Steagall Act that was put through after the last major financial crash of the late 1920s and the Depression in the 30s respected that core savings and core banking performed a similar role to, for example, Transpower in the electricity sector in New Zealand. That is, it's a grid that we can't afford to go down that connects pretty much every other part of the system. And the Glass-Steagall Act prevented banks from moving into the more speculative, higher risk parts of the market. So when that was reformed late last century, that was the beginning of what eventually ended up being the GFC. The other thing has been the development of derivatives and the trading of derivatives internationally, which were originally hedging instruments but have since become proprietary speculative instruments. And when they were investigated in the US, and the person looking at them moved to recommend that they be regulated, the lobbying in the US quickly saw that changed so that an act was passed to mean that they are now unregulated and will remain unregulated. The result of all of that is that while we've seen the bailing out of financial markets, particularly in Europe and in the US, and many of the savings of other wealthier countries in the world used to assist that,